Very tragic situation. I was living probably the normal American life, raising my children, going to basketball games, doing the things that most of us do with our kids. And one day, my son Johnny, the youngest, he came to me and he said, "Mom," he said, "I want to get a paper route because there's this dirt bike that I want to buy. And I've got it all figured out. I can do this. And it's the safest route in West Des Moines." It was the block that was just adjacent to where we lived. 26 houses, and he felt he could be doing this and earning money in order to buy this. It's a dirt bike right here. That's why it's on the back of my book. The first morning of the paper route, I agreed to let him have it. I took this picture of Johnny because I was one of those mothers that took a picture of the first time you do everything. And he's not smiling because he did not want his picture taken. He kept saying, "Oh, Mom, do you have to do that?" Well, little did I know at that moment that this would become the poster picture for America from missing children. I had no idea what was ahead. My son had his paper route for exactly 13 months. He had a perfect service award for each and every month. He did earn the money to buy that dirt bike and was enjoying riding with his older brother. And then came the morning of September 5th, 1982. Johnny started out on his paper route on a Sunday, and he normally always had his father go with him. And for some reason that we do not know yet today, he went alone. He decided to go alone. I didn't know anything was wrong until about an hour later when the phone started ringing and neighbors began to tell me that Johnny had not delivered the paper. What was wrong? What happened? They wanted their morning news. I ran down to his room and he was not there. So I assumed he was out on the route. His father went to look for him, and he came back within minutes with his face as white as a ghost, and he said, "Johnny's gone. His wagon is sitting up on the corner, and none of the bundles have been cut. Something's happened. Call the police right away." So I did call the police, and it took approximately 45 minutes for them to arrive at my home. We're going to count red flags here. Number one, red flag. We live 10 blocks from the police department, and it took 45 minutes for them to come on a missing child. In that 45 minutes, I called the district manager of the newspaper. I got the children's names who had picked up papers at that corner, all the witnesses that had seen and heard what took place. They each told me that a man had come to that corner. They gave a description of the man and the car. And in one situation, a 44-year-old attorney, who is now a judge in Des Moines, was also at the corner picking up his son's papers. They all witnessed this man taking my son aside to talk to him. And my son got scared, and he told the other kids, "I'm leaving. I'm going to go home. Something's wrong with this guy. I don't know what the deal is." So Johnny left. A few moments later, the witnesses heard our dog start barking. Johnny always took his little dog with him. At that moment, they looked down the street and they saw a very tall man come out between two houses and follow Johnny down to the corner and turn left. I doubt very much that my son even knew he was being followed. Within seconds, they heard the screeching of tires, car door slam, and the car ran the stop sign and turned left and went out of town, heading to the interstate. Excuse me. What started to happen next is a nightmare that no one would ever want to be a part of, that you would not want to live through. After the police arrived, finally, I gave them all the information. I filled out the missing persons report, and I told the young officer about the witnesses and what they saw. The officer looked at me and he said, "Well, has your son ever run away before?" And I said, "Didn't you hear me? What didn't you understand?" He left. We didn't see another police officer until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Excuse me. We were on our own. I began to organize searches. I called everybody I knew in Des Moines to begin to gather, go to the rivers, go to anywhere that would be a desolate area that you might consider a crime scene where they might find Johnny's body. Each search team came back with no news. The phone was ringing every 10 minutes. It went crazy because the media got involved. A group of searchers came back from searching near the river, which was in a state park. They were very angry. And they said that while they were searching the area, the police chief arrived in a squad car. He was drunk, and he stood up on a picnic table. Stood up on a picnic table, and he yelled through a bullhorn, "Everybody go on home, the kid's a damn runaway." Second red flag. Why would he do that? Johnny was only 12 years old. There was evidence of foul play. Why would he do that? You see, this case was building with red flags and points from the beginning that hindsight can show you today what they were covering up, that they didn't want to work on. Very quickly, this case took on national attention, because when I could not get the help from the police, I then placed a phone call to the FBI. And I grew up during the days of Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. and the FBI story. How many people ever watched that? You know. They came on the scene. They did the good thing. Well, 2 officers came to our home, or agents, I should say, special agents. They're special. They came to our home, and they sat at the table enjoying a cup of coffee, and they said, "Well, we won't be entering your case because we have no crime. It is up to you to prove that your son's life is in danger." I sat there in shock. I wasn't prepared for this. I had no idea what was coming. My entire knowledge of police work came from watching Cagney and Lacey. I didn't know how to conduct an investigation. So I made up my mind at that moment that I was going to have to hire private investigators. But then how was I going to pay for it if it went on for very long? I liquidated everything in my life insurance policy and any other money I could get my hands on to pay the retainer for investigators. From then on, I did fundraisers. Did anybody ever eat a World's Finest chocolate bar? With almonds? They're the best. We began selling them, and they developed a wrapper with Johnny's picture on it. We sold 400,000 candy bars. The World's Finest company loved us. We founded the Johnny Gosch Foundation as a vehicle to operate this huge thing that had become our big do-it-yourself project. Very quickly, after I founded the Johnny Gosch Foundation and they realized there were some dollar signs hanging around that were going to private investigators, guess who knocked on my door? The IRS. They wanted me to prove to them that I was doing something for other kids in the world. Because up to Johnny's case, every foundation for a missing child had been founded after the child's death, posthumously. Johnny's was the first organization of a currently missing child, so that made us different. That made us suspect. That made us somehow questionable in their eyes. So they demanded that I begin to do some kind of a program for other children. and under the tutelage of some people that were very knowledgeable in pedophile activity. And prior to this, I had never heard the word pedophile. Didn't know what it meant. I knew that children had been molested in our country, but I did not know the word pedophile. I don't think very many people did. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't on our news like it is today. What the IRS demanded of me was an awareness program, which I developed. It was called In Defense of Children, and it began the start of 700 programs that I did nationwide. Schools, churches, all types of civic organizations, and believe it or not, I was called in to give the profile of a pedophile to police departments in other states, never Iowa. They didn't like me there. They didn't care for me, because they did not like it that a mom was going forward doing what they chose not to do and getting publicity. This publicity, the campaign sales, caught the interest of the national media, and I was invited onto over 50 network TV shows, many of them repeats. An HBO movie was made about Johnny's life and Johnny's story. Countless newspaper, magazine articles, radio programs. Other boys were being taken throughout the country, all about the same age, fitting a similar description. So there appeared to be a pattern. This is one of the reasons the media jumped on it. This was information that was being supplied by our private investigator as well. In 1983, I was invited to testify before the Justice Department to get up and tell what went wrong in my son's case and name names, which I did, along with John Walsh and a number of other parents. When I spoke, I made the statement, and this was my last statement of my talk. I said, if the FBI is not going to investigate the crimes against children, missing children, abused and murdered children, then cut their funding. And I walked away from the microphone. There was dead silence in the auditorium. John Walsh, who was a friend of mine, and this was way before the days of America's Most Wanted. He wasn't a star yet. He was just a grieving parent like me. He came running up to me as fast as he could, and he said, I can't believe you said that. What, cut their money? And I said, yes. I said, if they're not going to use a portion of the money that they are granted to do these investigations, which come under their jurisdiction, then give the money to us, and we'll form our own organization. Within 3 weeks, we had the first $10 million from the Justice Department, and that's what started the National Center for Missing Children. It is... We now have internet investigators that go online. They pose as 13-year-old children. They lure pedophiles into a situation, get their name, the address. Sometimes these pedophiles will send plane tickets for these kids to fly to be abused. Once this information is gathered, it is given to the National Center for Missing Children, and the police go out and they arrest the guys. So there's been a great deal of progress since Johnny was kidnapped. But it took a long time to get there. The following year, in 1984, I was invited to testify before Senate hearings in Washington, organized crime hearings. Ken Lanning of the FBI also presented that day. He had a table, much like the ones we have our literature on today. And on this table were publications on how to molest a toddler and leave no markings, how to lure children into a car, all sorts of sexual toys and paraphernalia that would be used in the torture of children. And one book that really shocked me was a catalog. Pictures of children that had not yet been abducted. These kids had been photographed in their play yards, in their school yards, on their way to and from schools, and put in a book Wealthy pedophiles, connected pedophiles, political pedophiles, religious pedophiles. It makes no difference. Titles make no difference. The ones that had the money could pay somebody to go abduct a child. And that's what they did. Kiddie porn business is a multi-billion-dollar business in this country. And the pedophile is the worst predator on the planet concerning children. In my investigation, and I am a private investigator now, I have sat across the table from serial killers, from people who had molested children and not killed them. I've interviewed both. In the case of the serial killers, I asked the men, why did you have to kill the child? And they looked at me and they said, I like to kill. They would get this smile on their face that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The pedophiles would say to me, well, you know, since I've been in prison, I've found God. And I'm coming up for parole. And I've convinced the parole board that I can do better if I'm let out and I can live a normal life. I said, really? And I said, what are you going to do when you get out of prison? And they said, well, I'd like to get another child. They told me that. They were not ashamed of it. And I said, well, what if I told the warden after I leave my visit with you that that's your intent, is to get out of prison under the guise that you've changed your life and that you just want to get your hands on another child? And he said, they'll never believe you because I've been a model prisoner. And they are. They are model. They're very charming. Most pedophiles would have to be charming because no child would go with somebody that's mean and rotten. They go with somebody that is luring them, conning them. We had a very fast case. In other words, there was always something happening that made it newsworthy. If the name Gosch went across the Associated Press, papers all over the United States picked it up. And we had a lot of activity on the case due to all the media attention. So one kind of fed the next and the next. I would be on a show, and then we would get a lot of leads. Yes, some of them turned out not to be good leads, but many of them were good information that we could give the private investigators, and then they could begin to keep building the pieces for the gigantic jigsaw puzzle that I had in front of me. Nothing has ever been more frustrating or painful in my entire life. At this point in my life, I could live through anything because I've been through the worst. When someone takes your child and you have no idea where that child's at or what's being done to them, you're living in a nightmare, and it never ends. Everyone else has control of your world but you. You have to employ some self-preservation tactics really quick, or you go under. You go down with it. In my work, I also wrote legislation for the state of Iowa, which later became passed in 7 other states, and I also worked on federal legislation that would be meaningful for children. It's not perfect yet because we still have the crimes, but it's a lot better than it was in 1982. And we have a lot of dedicated people that are trying to help. It wasn't until 1989 to 1992 that the big break in the case came. I know that a lot of you are familiar with John DeCamp, who wrote the Franklin cover-up. A little round of applause for John. The Franklin scandal began in Omaha, Nebraska, with the head of the Franklin Credit Union as being the operator and the director of a huge pornography and prostitution ring using primarily boys, some girls, but mostly boys. And he was supplying children for elite, elaborate parties all the way to Washington, D.C., for dignitaries, politicians, rich businessmen. Sounds hard to believe, doesn't it? Sounds like something that would be out of a movie. That's what I thought too. John DeCamp worked in this. There were 80 children that came forward with all of their stories. He represented one young man by the name of Paul Benassi. Paul Benassi is a multiple personality disorder person due to the abuse that he suffered. During one of their consultations, Paul Benassi came forward with a statement that rocked John DeCamp. He said, I was there. I was there in Des Moines when they took that paper boy. They made me help. DeCamp thought, whoa, this is that big case. So then DeCamp got him to talk a little more about where they took him, how long Johnny was kept, and as it turned out, Paul Benassi was the very first person to molest my son on camera. John DeCamp contacted us at our home. I was not home, I was working, and so my husband at that time went to John DeCamp's office and to the prison to meet with Paul Benassi because he had been incarcerated for telling the truth. They charged him with perjury for naming the people in Omaha, Nebraska that had molested him. And he was in prison along with a couple of the other kids for a few years. During the time that Paul was relating his whole story, he gave details about Johnny's case that he could have only known if he had been there. Due to the fact that we did our own private investigation, there were files and records and information that was not given to the police, was not made public. They weren't going to help me, so I kept my own investigation going, waiting for the day when someone would come forward with information and know the details that I had learned. Paul Benassi was that young man. We were thrilled. We thought, finally, we're going to get some help. Much to my shock, the police said, well, he's a nutball. You can't believe a word he says, because he had MPD. The attorney, John DeCamp, hired and brought in investigators, psychologists, psychiatrists, lie detector tests for Paul Benassi. He passed them all. Every single one of the psychologists said that he was telling the truth concerning my son's case and all of the abuse that he suffered. But it did no good. We still went for 10 long years. I was continuing my investigation, and yet nothing was happening. Paul Benassi was sitting there being not believed. Then in 1994, there had been Yorkshire Television from Yorkshire, England. They came to Des Moines, they came to Nebraska. They filmed for about a year in the United States, putting together what's called the Conspiracy of Silence. This is the trail of the usage of young boys from the Midwest, from Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, all the way to the White House. May 4th of 1994, it was to be aired on the Discovery Channel. And then without warning, the TV station was notified to take it off for that night's airing. It was not to be shown in the United States, and that all copies were ordered to be destroyed. This was the order given to Yorkshire TV. A bootleg copy was smuggled out of Yorkshire TV to John DeCamp. John DeCamp contacted me and said, here, take one. Have it reproduced, distribute it everywhere. So that's what I've been doing as well. I had the copies made, and it's shocking to people that it was so well planned, that it was so sophisticated, that these pedophiles could actually run an operation like this for years and have it not be challenged. Just as the Senate hearing that I participated in, with all the evidence that was on the tables, including the catalog, wouldn't you think that those U.S. senators would have done something about the information? They didn't. This Senate hearing was nothing more than an exercise of, oh, let's pay for a few people to come in and talk in front of the Washington Press Corps. We'll make them look like we're doing something for missing children. They did nothing. Absolutely nothing. One of the things that Paul Benassi was also sharing with us, and this was about the time that 2020 got involved again. They had shown stories about Johnny throughout the years, but they decided they wanted to do a one last time, 1 hour special, the final curtain, what happened to Johnny Gosch. So we filmed for almost 2 years. And while we were involved with Paul Benassi, and we're talking with him and they're interviewing him, Paul comes out with a reaction to a question by the producer. She said, how did they control the boys? You know, they've had these kids kidnapped. Some of them are getting older. What do they use them for and why? Paul Benassi said, some of them are turned into perpetrators when they get older. Some of them are murdered if they give trouble. And some they just get away. And they have to live a life as a fugitive because we're all forced to commit a felony as soon as we are taken. But he said the other thing they do, and he said, you're going to find this hard to believe. He said they use mind control on us. They use a program called Monarch, MK Ultra, in which the kids are actually transformed into robots, little miniature Manchurian candidates, drug couriers, you name it. They can program that into a child by the use of this program. Now, if anybody knows their history on MK Ultra, it came into being at a time that our country was fighting the Cold War. And it was thought to be useful, it was thought to be a good thing at that time to protect the United States. However, a group of what I call rogues, or people that had ulterior motives and different agendas, who also happened to be pedophiles, decided this MK Ultra program would work so easily on children because they make fabulous subjects. And who would suspect a child as being a drug courier? Who would suspect a child as one that would compromise a politician sexually on film, photographed by the photographers hired for this purpose? So this plan went into effect. And do you know what paid for it? Your tax dollars. That's what paid for MK Ultra. Our tax dollars paid for the very program that they turned around and used on children. That's why on my book it says pornography, prostitution, mind control, and espionage. People have questioned me on that. Espionage? What do you mean? The children were used in this manner. Well, at the point that we learned all of this from Paul Benassi, I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I can remember sitting there as the 2020 people explained all this to me with tears rolling down my face saying, no, now wait a minute. This can't happen. This is America. We have rights. We still have rights. They can't just take my child and do this. And they said, I'm sorry. This is what happened. And Johnny is one of the victims. They went on to dig out government records supporting all of this information, and I've given confirmation of all of that in my book. What I thought was the unthinkable was the reality. That's what my son was used for, and countless other children. Don't be fooled by the news reports that the FBI gives you on the news that says the crime rate is going down. We have fewer missing children's cases than ever before. It's not true. We have more than ever before. After 10 years, after 10 long years of investigation, Paul Benassi was allowed to file a civil rights action against his perpetrator, this Mr. Larry King, who is the founder of the Franklin Credit Union, not the Larry King on television. During this court hearing, this civil rights action, Paul Bonacci was asked by the judge to give an accounting of his own abuse and the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch. Paul Bonacci gave word for word what happened, the same information he gave me 10 years before. Paul never changes his stories. If he doesn't have an answer to something, he will say, "I'm sorry, I don't know that." But the point is, he tells the truth. He never changes anything. He informed the judge that the kids were taken for the purpose of the mind control and the usage of all the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So the judge said, well, why did they want a kid like Johnny Gosch? Why would they take the risk to kidnap a kid from a normal home, 2 parents, a dog, the paper route, the whole bit, when there's lots of runaway kids on the street that they could have access to? And the response from Paul Bonacci was this. They had already experimented on kids that had street sense, the runaways, the throwaways, the kids that are available to them. They wanted to experiment and use this MK Ultra Monarch program on kids that came from normal homes to see if they would be as accessible and as easy to program, if they were more naive, and could it be done easier. That was that big surge of boy kidnappings through the 80s that took place. That's when most of the experimentation was occurring. The judge sat there, rapped his gavel a couple of times, and stated that he believed every word that Paul Bonacci was now giving in federal court. Now, this is the very same judge that had 10 years before said Paul Bonacci was a nut. Somehow, miraculously, for some reason, 10 years later, he ruled in favor of him. And then the judge did one thing more. He granted Paul Bonacci $1 million in damages against his perpetrator, Larry King, who just got out of prison last week. Now, whether Larry King will pay the $1 million or not, I don't know. But what that did was set a precedent for all sexual abuse victims from now till the end of time, that they could actually go to a court and file a civil rights action against a perpetrator and win. So it's down in the books as a win. He may not see the money. But what this did was change the status of my son's case too. Because in court the judge said that he believed every word that he had said about Johnny's kidnapping. The how, the why, and the who. We were very excited. So we took this information back to the authorities in Des Moines, who up till now had not investigated the whole Bonacci aspect of the case because they said he was not credible. Well, now he was credible. The county attorney and the local police looked at me and they said, well, I'm sorry, we don't accept the federal court ruling. After all that work, 10 years of our lives, all the court appearances, they simply looked at me and said, we don't accept it. That's where the case stands right now. My son is still alive. He is one of the fugitives. We know that and we can prove that. He doesn't have a decent life. He can't come over for dinner. He can't be part of my life because of this. What has happened to my son is happening to lots of others. I just was fortunate in getting a lot of publicity for my son's case and the ability to get out there and tell the story. And what I've done with the Why Johnny Can't Come Home, my book, is to tell other families through this information, you can do it too. If they tell you to stay home and sit back and shut up and just give up your child, you don't have to. You can dig, you can find the answers. It may not bring you comfort, but at least you'll know what happened. I feel very sad about what's happened to my son and all the others, but at least the information is out there for people to know that this is occurring. And it's not going to be swept under the rug. And I get my share of death threats. I've had them. But for some reason, they haven't acted on them in all these years. And that's a good thing. But if they did, I would at least know that I did the best I could.
Right.
And that is why Johnny can't come home. His life is in danger, and probably will be until there's some arrests made. And the stalemate is the authorities won't take action because they said